Want to know why? Ask how. Howard the Humorous! The Ukraine. We did 2 previous videos on the Ukraine, and the Ukraine is turning into an extremely dangerous situation. The man who was taken over as Prime Minister of the Western Ukraine made a very powerful, emotional speech in which he talked about being on the brink of war. Why? Because Russian troops have massed on the borders of the Ukraine, because there are unmarked troops in unmarked vehicles with unmarked uniforms all over the Crimea right now, and they seem to be Russian, because the statements coming out of the news sources that reflect Vladimir Putin's views say that only Russia can bring peace to the Ukraine, that the Western Ukraine has been taken over by Molotov cocktail throwing, arms carrying fanatics, terrorists, Nazis, gangsters, and that if anybody cares anything about peace, there is only one democratically elected head of the Ukraine, and it's Yanukovych, the guy who just fled from the Ukraine. Now, our version of things is there were peaceful street demonstrations, and those peaceful street demonstrations occurred because the Ukrainians wanted, at least the Western Ukrainians, the ones who speak the Ukrainian language, wanted to be part of the European Union. And the Eastern Ukrainians, the ones who speak Russian, wanted to go with Russia. And Yanukovych, the head of the country, had agreed, he'd visited Moscow, and he'd agreed with Vladimir Putin that indeed the Ukraine should go with a package, a rescue package, to keep the country out of bankruptcy. The country is broke. And that rescue package to keep the country out of bankruptcy was coming from Vladimir Putin, the great and wondrous hero who brings money along with the tooth fairy whenever you need it, who saves countries that are in trouble, the way he's saving Syria today. The Ukrainian people, according to our narrative, wanted to go with the the European Union. They did not want to go with Russia. They did not want to live under a Putinocracy, under a kleptocracy, under a mobocracy, under a thugocracy. And they took to the streets. But that is not the way the story is told in Russia. In Russia, the story is told that it was terrorists who took to the streets. Now, there's a certain amount of validity to this. There are forces in the Western Ukraine who were as Nazi as the Nazis, even though they often had their disagreements with the Nazis. And there were people, you saw them on the newscasts in the street, not peacefully protesting, but making Molotov cocktails, bringing entire barrels full of empty bottles into the square on which all of this demonstration took place, because they wanted to fill them with gasoline and turn them into Molotov cocktails. And Molotov cocktails are as lethal a weapon as a bullet. They are not peaceful protest devices. Right now, so we have the head, the mobs in the street, our narrative goes, got rid of Yanukovych and he fled. And a new prime minister called for by the people who were taking to the streets has taken control. And by fleeing to Russian territory, Yanukovych has shown where his real allegiances were. The Russians are massing forces because they want to take this country over. It's a country that wants to go with the EU, that wants to be Western, and we have to do something about it. Well, the big problem is this. There are lots of quibbles and lots of arguments about the historical roots of all of this. I gave a narrative yesterday in which I spoke of how the original Vikings who established Russia established it in Kiev, in the Ukraine. And the head of Russia, the center of Russia, did not move to Moscow until 600 years later. One of the people criticizing my interpretation of history pointed out that when the Mongols showed up, the folks in Moscow, which was still a weak principality, the folks in Moscow caved in and gave tribute to the Mongols. And the people from Kiev, the Russian princes of Kiev, who were the Russian princes at the time, the Russian princes in Ukraine never gave in to the Mongols. The bottom line is this. We can quibble this a million times until Monday. We can talk about the Tatars, who were and are Muslims who live in what's now the Ukraine. We can talk about the Cossacks, who at some points fought against the Russians, and at others, for hundreds of years at a time, became auxiliary troops in the Russian army. We can talk about a wide variety of things, but it all comes down to this. What are we going to do? Or better yet, what are our options? We can sit by and watch as Russia and Putin take over just the eastern Ukraine or the entire Ukraine. Now again, the media outlets that speak on behalf of Putin have said that Putin, because he's the bringer of peace, does not want to see civil war in the Ukraine. And he doesn't want to see separatism take over the Ukraine and break the Ukraine up. He wants peace. And the implication is that his vision of peace is to make sure the Ukraine stays in one piece and that all of it is saved by Russia. The media outlets speaking on behalf of Russia say that only Vladimir Putin and Russia can take this country, the Ukraine, and keep it from being a failed state. Only Russia can bring it out of its economic doldrums. They tend to overlook the fact that most of Russian industry has gone into the tank, and Russia is being supported almost entirely by its gas and oil industry, thus turning it into one of the primitive gas and oil states that lives off of just one thing, gas and oil, not off of industry. Industry is when you use your intelligence, you use your creativity, and you use your your ability to work to go out and create something new. That is not something that Russia is into. But guess what? In the Ukraine, there's an industry that has built Russia's most advanced rockets. It has done the research and development for Russia's most advanced rockets. There is a next technology industry in the Ukraine. And of course, in the Ukraine, there is the entire Baltic fleet, which Russia's Baltic fleet, its only warm water fleet, which is headquartered at Sebastopol. The Crimea is of incredible importance to Russia. Again, everything comes down to the bottom line. What are our options in this situation? Option number one is to sit back, relax, and watch Vladimir Putin take over all of the Ukraine. Some of us remember when we sat back and watched, was our parents' or grandparents' generation, as Adolf Hitler took over a swatch of space that had tons of German-speaking people, and he said wanted more than anything else to be part of Germany, the Sudetenland. It was the early stage of World War I. We can send troops there. We can have a war. This wouldn't be the first war in the Ukraine. It wouldn't be the first war between the West and Russia. France and Great Britain, along with Sardinia and the Ottoman Empire, fought a war against Russia in 1853 to 1856. It was the first war in which telegraph wires were used, the first war in which railroad trains were used, the first modern war preceding even the American Civil War, which wouldn't take place for another roughly 7 years. It was a war in which 600,000 troops, 600,000 soldiers lost their lives. That is a hideous toll. And it was called the Crimean War. Why? Because it was over the Ukraine. Option number one is do nothing and possibly encourage broader expansion on the part of Russia. Option number two, send troops. Take a chance on having a war. Option number three is the one that actually was developed in the form of trade embargoes a long time ago in the wars between Napoleon and Great Britain. But it's much more sophisticated. Today it means cutting off all sources of money using computerized equipment, cutting off funds. It's called sanctions. We believe it worked in Iran. Did it work in Iran? Did it bring Iran to the negotiating table? Or did Iran come to the negotiating table because it sensed that Barack Obama, the president of the United States, was soft and doesn't know how to negotiate? And as a consequence, they could offer as great concessions things that they were going to do anyway. They needed to take a breather. They had just gone from 6,000 centrifuges to 18,000 centrifuges. That's a big jump. They had just enriched a whole bunch of uranium. In the past, 6 years ago, they were only enriching up to 5%. Now they're enriching up to 20%. They were about to bring online a whole new generation of even more sophisticated centrifuges. They presumably needed time to go from the old centrifuges, the ones of which they had 18,000, to their third generation of centrifuges. And they came to the negotiating table offering that time as if it were a huge concession, the breathing space that they needed to go to one technology from one technology to another. And they offered to put their 20% uranium through a process that would turn it into a lower grade of uranium, but a grade of uranium that's easily converted back to 20%. You need 90% uranium to make nuclear weapons. But getting from 20%, getting from 5% to 20% is far harder than getting from 20% to 90%. So, did sanctions work? Did sanctions bring Iran to its knees? Or was Iran simply taking advantage of the fact that Barack Obama, like Neville Chamberlain, wants to imagine that he's gotten peace, and maybe too naive to realize when he's been conned? I leave you to decide that. What else have we got? We've got pinpoint attacks on individuals who irk us, or who we feel are responsible for a war, using drones, something actually that the Israelis developed. They built the first autonomous drones in the 1980s, and we took the technology from them. Well, this is an infinitely more efficient way. It's a great way to keep from losing 600,000 lives on a war. And in a modern war, where nuclear weapons are involved, God knows what the actual toll would be. 600,000 was the figure from a day when the entire Earth's population was approximately 1/7 of what it is today. Scale that figure up, multiply it, and you get, well, my arithmetic is very poor, but I get something like 5 million people killed in a war. Even if we only followed the pattern of the Crimean War and took account of the fact that there are roughly 6 or 7 times as many humans on the planet today as there were in the Crimean War. We can argue with all the sophistication at our disposal. We can argue about the days when the Ukraine was not under the control of Russia, when it was under the control of Poland. We can argue about the days when the Ukraine was not under the possession of Russia. It was under the control of the Lithuanians, of all people. We can argue about the differences between the Ukrainian language and the Russian language, which both seem to have started at the same roots and split. We can argue about whether the word Slav comes from the fact that the Viking founders of the Russian Empire took Slavs, the local population, as slaves and sold them down in Constantinople. We can talk about the fact that according to one dictionary etymology, it was the other way around, that the word slaves in French, esclave, and English, which derives from the French, was taken from the name for the Slavs, because the Slavs were traditionally turned into slaves by the Viking princes who built the principalities that became Russia and who called themselves the Rus. We can argue that for all we're worth, but it all comes down to this. Are we going to use military force? Are we simply going to use economic sanctions? Are we going to try pinpoint attacks of some kind? Who is there to attack after all? I can't figure it out. Using drones? Or are we going to sit back and feel like absolute wusses and recognize that we may possibly be encouraging another Hitler? Those are our options. Our arguments about where this war came from and its historical antecedents mean far less than a simple discussion of which of those limited number of options we are willing to use. The Ukraine is an enormous problem right now, but it all comes down to what in medicine are called your treatment modalities. What are we going to do about it? Is there anything beyond those 3 options? This is Howard the Humongous. Wait, before we do that, there is one potential option. and that is using our NSA-style spying devices to pinpoint individuals that we feel may be problematic and to cut them off electronically. But frankly, who is there? There's only one person that's proving a problem to us that we can identify right now. He's Vladimir Putin. Are we going to attack his communications? Vladimir Putin's? Well, should we consider it? Who knows? It all comes down to the same bottom line. What are our treatment modalities? What are our practical options? This is Howard the Humongous, speaking to you from the future. It's your job and my job to caretake and to make. Or, want to know why? Ask how. Oh, the off button. I forgot the off button. Ah, there. I've got it.